Okay, everyone. So the rest of the class is basically going to be dealing with the 20th century. The beginning of the 20th century, for a lot of historians, dates not to 1900, although of course that is technically the beginning of the 20th century, but until 1914. Some historians even describe something called the long 19th century, from 1789, which is to say the French Revolution, to 1914, which is to say the First World War. Between those two conflicts, obviously a whole lot happened. We've talked a lot about it in this class, but there is something unifying about that period. It seems to be a transitional period where a lot of different countries in Europe, Germany included, are redefining or reaffirming their identities, and in general, there seems to be a kind of a wave of democracy, a sort of Republican-style government that is taking hold of the continent, of the Western world, in many places. But, as we've noted, as the historians who are proponents of the special path or Sonderweg thesis have told us, this does not take place in Germany. So when we last left our friends, the Germans, they had recently unified, become a single united German state, or rather two united German states, Austria in the east and the German Empire in the west, with, of course, most of the power, the seat of power, the emperor, sitting in Prussia. So what are the preludes to the First World War? It's important to remember that at the time, nobody knew that that's where things were going, right? With that said, a lot of people, Germans, for example, remember very well the last time that Germany had waged serious wars, specifically the Franco-Prussian War and the Austro-Prussian War. Those wars were over very quickly. The Germans were sort of unquestionably victorious, and it resulted in a lot of really good things happening for the lands that become the German Empire, right? So one of the main crises that kind of precipitates a new balance of power on the continent is something called the Near Eastern Crisis, okay? And this basically is the result of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, okay? So the Ottoman Empire is a Turkish-speaking empire that rules over much of what today is the Middle East. The Ottomans, however, didn't just control the Middle East, they also controlled the area of Europe that today we call the Balkans. The Balkans is southeastern Europe. It's a little sort of foot of Europe that, brushes up against what is modern-day Turkey. And it includes the various countries: Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Herzegovina, Kosovo, Greece, of course. I'm sure I'm missing a couple, but the point is there's a whole lot of different ethnic groups that are sort of squeezed together in this part of Europe called the Balkans. And those countries, those peoples, at the end of the 19th century, are increasingly eager to create their own states, their own nation states, and stop being part of this massive empire. And the various powers in Western Europe, Germany included, notice this. And they are very eager to do what they can to kind of chip away at the power of the Ottoman Empire, okay? At this point, the Ottomans are sometimes called the sick man of Europe, meaning they are they are seen as this kind of aging, old sort of relic of a time that has now passed. And so the question becomes, which of the major European powers are going to succeed in replacing the Ottomans as ruler of those land? Russia and Turkey, that is to say Russia and the Ottoman Empire, wage a series of wars in which Germany becomes intimately involved as kind of a mediator and a peacekeeper. This makes Germany seen as kind of a friend of the Ottomans. All of this is to say something called the Near Eastern Crisis emerges between 1877 and 1878. This essentially happens when Christian peasants in the areas that are today Bosnia and Bulgaria rebel against Ottoman rule. Now, shortly thereafter, the Christian allies of these peasants who reside in what are today Serbia and Montenegro, they declare war on the Ottoman Empire, okay? And because Serbia in particular shares a common language with the Russian Empire, they're both Slavic-speaking countries, Russia uses this as an opportunity to basically send thousands of volunteers to go join the Serbian army to fight against the Ottomans. Meanwhile, our old friend Austria, they extract something from Russia in order to do this, which is that they are allowed to occupy the area that is today Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Treaty of Berlin, which is signed in 1878, again, Germany acting as this kind of mediator in these various rivalries that are happening in the Balkans, ended up creating a smaller Bulgarian state, so an independent Bulgaria, that would remain under Russian protection, while also allowing Austria to basically occupy Bosnia-Herzegovina for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, which is between Greece and Turkey, the modern states of Greece and Turkey, is basically given to the British. Okay, so all of these rival European powers are managing to basically take bites out of the territory that was once Ottoman. Now, at the time, this was seen as a major victory for peace, because this allowed Europe to basically avoid a major war over the future of the Balkans and the future of the territories of the Ottoman Empire. But it very much led to a deterioration in Russian and German relations, okay? Because the Germans were clearly sort of on the side of the Ottomans in this conflict, even though they didn't actually participate in the war. Now, before we get into the immediate causes of the First World War, it's worth taking a moment to think about the culture that emerges in Germany at this time. So one of the major changes that starts to take place in Germany is the emergence of what is defined as youth culture, okay? So many of the generation that was born after 1870, which is to say after the unification of Germany, grew up feeling somewhat alienated by the social and economic upheavals that were taking place as a result of rapid industrialization, as a result of sort of this very kind of assertive and aggressive form of capitalism that exists in Europe at the time. And there is more and more this desire to rebel against the values and lifestyles of their parents. Now, to some extent, of course, youth in just about every generation take it upon themselves to rebel against their parents. But there is something kind of unique that starts to happen right around this period, at the end of the 19th century, where this cultural movement among youth starts to be represented far more in the press, in literature, especially in print culture. And of course, around this time, you even start to get the very, very early versions of what later becomes radio technology. So that you start to get the ability to sort of transmit ideas, transmit culture across vast distances much, much more quickly. This, of course, is also the moment when cinema is invented. So the very first films start to be filmed in the 1880s. Shortly thereafter, they sort of spread. They begin in, I think the first film is filmed in Britain, and quickly they spread across Europe, particularly in France, but also very, very prominently in Germany. At the same time that youth culture is starting to come into its own, you have the emergence of something called, quote, the new woman, all right? And the new woman is this result of the first wave of the feminist movement. But this idea that women should participate in the public sphere, should have equal certainly equal legal rights, as well as an equal political voice. The idea that women should be able to vote, of course. At this point, suffrage did not extend to women in most places. And they are quite successful, in fact, at least at the early stages of this movement. So by the 1880s, mandatory secondary education, so high school, right, is extended to middle-class girls. So it's not extended to every woman in the country, but nonetheless, women are sort of accepted into public schools and, in many cases, becomes compulsory. In 1900, you have a change in the legal code, which for the first time, at least since the Middle Ages, allowed women to hold wealth and property independently of their husbands. This was a major achievement. Finally, between 1900 and 1909, women for the first time are permitted to attend German universities. But, as we probably all know, as soon as women in a lot of places, a lot of cultures, a lot of contexts, end up asserting their own innate human rights, the result is a crisis of masculinity for many men. With the rise of these women's suffrage movements, of the successes of first wave feminist movements, you have a growing anxiety among middle-class men in particular over the dangers of female sexuality, okay? And there is, combined with this anxiety, concern over these seemingly rebellious youth, right? This emergence of youth culture, and this idea that there's sort of lax morals among young people, and pretty soon these two things combine to create a full-blown moral panic, okay? Now, while this moral panic is happening, of course, advances in various fields of science and biology mean that there's an increased scientific interest, increased scientific awareness, and increased public knowledge about questions of sexuality. So this is the time when Sigmund Freud, inventor of psychoanalysis, really comes to prominence. You also, as a corollary to this, and within the context of this crisis of masculinity, have a very prominent homosexual culture that emerges in Germany, especially in Berlin, but elsewhere as well. So you have the world's first homosexual magazine, for example, which is published in Berlin between 1896 and 1932. The Berlin police openly permitted 40 homosexual brothels to operate without penalty, and it's been estimated that there were at least between 1,000 and 2,000 male homosexual prostitutes operating just within the confines of the city of Berlin. This crisis of masculinity, on the one hand, it is not particularly surprising, what we know of how cultures respond when there are these challenges to quote-unquote traditional systems of morality. But we also have to understand that this moral panic that emerges does not seem to slow down in any way what is quite avant-garde sort of experiments in social living, somewhat surprisingly, in the very conservative German Empire.